Rudolf Höss is remembered in history for his role as the Commandant of Auschwitz, in which he oversaw the mass murder of over 1 million people. At the Nuremberg Trials, he was brought forward to testify as a defence witness for Ernst Kaltenbrunner, and he made a remarkable statement which encapsulated the horrific mass murder machine of the Holocaust. He stated, "I commanded Auschwitz until the 1st of December 1943, and estimate that at least 2.5 million people were executed and exterminated there by gassing and burning, and at least another 500,000 succumbed to starvation and disease, making the total about 3 million dead." When he said this, he spoke coldly with no emotion or remorse. Hearst ultimately was sentenced to death for his crimes and involvement in mass murder, and was executed on a specially built gallows inside of the camp he once oversaw. Join us today as we look at the despicable crimes of Rudolf Höss, the Commandant of Auschwitz. Remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Rudolf Höss was hanged on the 16th of April 1947, but what were his crimes that he committed? He joined the SS on the 1st of April 1934, responding to Himmler's calls to action, and within a year he moved into the notorious Death Heads unit. The SS Totenkopfverbände, as they were known, or the SSTV, were ultimately the ones who were involved in running the concentration and extermination camps across Germany, and during the Second World War, territory occupied by the Germans following invasion. Höss's first role inside a concentration camp was at Dachau, where he worked as a block leader under Theodor Eicke, who he viewed as a mentor. Whilst here, he was promoted a number of times, and was known to have been very loyal to Heinrich Himmler and his murderous intentions. Hearst was then drafted to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where he worked as an assistant and adjutant to Hermann Baranowski, who was noted to himself have been a sadistic killer at the camp. But whilst at Sachsenhausen, Hearst was placed in charge of a firing squad, and on the 15th of September 1939, on the orders of Heinrich Himmler, he was in charge of the soldiers who shot August Dickmann, a Jehovah's Witness who was the first conscientious objector executed during World War II. Hearst was the one who, following the shooting, delivered a final shot from his pistol into Dickmann's head. He then joined the Waffen-SS following the invasion of Poland, and gained more promotions, and he remained inside the SS. He was working as a head of the protective custody camp at Sachsenhausen, and whilst here, Hearst was incredibly brutal. He ordered on a number of occasions prisoners not assigned to work groups to stand outside in temperatures around -30 degrees Celsius. Many of the inmates had no coats, and some had frozen to death. During one time he did this, 78 prisoners died, and 67 prisoners died that following evening. He even denied prisoners a chance to go to the infirmary, and ordered that the hospital doors should be closed. It was this murderous intent and personality that made him the perfect candidate within the SS and the Nazi Party to oversee a concentration camp that would become the deadliest in the whole of the Holocaust. He was clearly well thought of by Himmler, and was tasked with considering how feasible it would be to make a concentration camp in western Poland. Hearst's report ultimately led to the creation of Auschwitz, and the camp was built around the site of an old Austro-Hungarian and Polish army barracks. The camp began life initially as rather modest in its size, but then it became colossal during the time in which Hearst acted as the camp's commandant. Hearst was the one with all the power at Auschwitz, and he was at the top, and he expanded the camp into a huge network of subcamps, and it was he who was responsible for the creation of the killing chambers and the gas chambers. Hearst had intended to do things differently at Auschwitz, and he wished to make the camp as efficient as it possibly could, and he became obsessed with production quotas, and ultimately he would become obsessed with the destructive figures that would show the daily death and destruction there. Whilst inside of Auschwitz, Hearst lived in relative luxury, inside a huge villa nearby with his wife and 5 children. Whilst these were living extremely comfortable, within a short distance, people were being killed and burned inside the crematoria. It's likely that the family would have smelt the smoke from their villa. Hearst would instill a reign of fear into the camp, which was perpetuated by guards that he made sure would treat the prisoners violently and with contempt. He set up Block 11, the notorious torture chamber at Auschwitz, where prisoners would be forced into tiny cells, and between Block 10 and Block 11 was a death wall, where thousands of prisoners were executed by firing squads there. Hearst claimed that he was summoned to Berlin in June 1941 to meet with Heinrich Himmler in person to receive important orders. It was said at this meeting that Himmler informed Hearst that Hitler had ordered the final solution, and Himmler had chosen Auschwitz as a major site for the extermination of Europe's Jews. This was done allegedly due to its links and access by rail, and also due to the large site and the fact it was rather isolated at the time. Hearst was ordered not to speak about it, and he later would inform his wife of Auschwitz's true purpose at the end of 1942, confirming after she'd already found out what was happening there. It was said Adolf Eichmann would give Hearst his orders, but over time he began to test and trial different methods of mass murder in September 1941. He wished for Auschwitz, his camp, to become the most efficient murder site used by the Nazis to carry out the final solution, and during these sick trials, thousands would be killed in different ways. Hearst instigated the rules which today are so familiar with the practices of Auschwitz. Once prisoners disembarked off trains, they were sorted into those who would be admitted into the camp, and those who would be selected. The prisoners were separated by men and women and children, and the elderly, sick, children, and those women who were deemed not to be useful to work were usually sent straight to the gas chambers to be killed. Gassing using Zyklon B was the chosen method at Auschwitz, as it was deemed to have been the most efficient, and at first small gassing bunkers were set up in the woods under the cover of the trees, but later Hearst expanded the gas chambers, and over time 4 huge death chambers were made along with crematoria that made the killing process more efficient. Hearst later said, technically it wasn't so hard. It would not have been hard to exterminate even greater numbers. The killing itself took the least time. You could dispose of 2,000 in half an hour, but it was the burning that took all the time. The killing was easy. You didn't even need guards to drive them into the chambers. They just went in expecting to take showers, and instead of water we turned on poison gas. The whole thing went very quickly. Hearst had his deputies test different methods, and Zyklon B was selected as a pesticide to be used, as it took between 3 and 15 minutes for someone to die. However, Hearst fell from grace rather shockingly, as he was sacked after having an affair with a political prisoner at the camp, who was then imprisoned while she was pregnant in a standing cell. She was forced to have a termination, and only just escaped being sent to the gas chambers. He was replaced by Arthur Lieber Henschel on the 10th of November 1943, but then would return in the following May to continue his barbaric crimes and execution work. Hearst was invited back to the camp to oversee Operation Hearst, a huge killing mission that saw 430,000 Hungarian Jews killed in 56 murderous days. The sheer amount of killing inside the gas chambers was a problem for Auschwitz, and there was simply not enough time and space to dispose of the huge volume of bodies. Because of this, Hearst ordered that camp staff should burn the thousands of bodies in huge open pits. 10,000 people were being gassed each day during Operation Hearst, and many were shot quickly by the SS before being thrown into the fires and weren't even gassed. He saw out the end of the war at Ravensbrück, and he continued gassing. Whilst at the all-female camp, following the completion of the gas chambers, he forced more than 2,000 women and girls into them, having them killed barbarically. Rudolf Höss's long list of crimes would eventually catch up with him. He was told by Himmler to disguise himself as the war turned against the Germans, and he did escape for around a year, but was arrested in March 1946. He tried to take his own life biting into a cyanide capsule, but this attempt failed. He was beaten by the men who apprehended him with axe handles, but he was surprisingly called to testify at the Nuremberg Trials. He was not a defendant, but was seen as a defence witness for Ernst Kaltenbrunner. His testimony amazed, as he would admit the murderous actions of himself and his crimes that were carried out at Auschwitz, and he spoke of them with almost a bursting pride and with no sense of remorse. He did not care for the millions of victims he had sent to their deaths, and he simply was proud of the efficiency that he believed he had performed his job with. He said of his 3 million death toll that this figure represents about 70 or 80% of all persons sent to Auschwitz as prisoners, the remainder having been selected and used for slave labour in the concentration camp industries. Included amongst the executed and burned were approximately 20,000 Russian prisoners of war, who were delivered at Auschwitz in Wehrmacht transports operated by regular Wehrmacht officers and men. The remainder of the total number of victims included about 100,000 German Jews and greater numbers of citizens, mostly Jewish, from the Netherlands, France, Belgium, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Greece, or other countries. We executed around 400,000 Hungarian Jews alone at Auschwitz in the summer of 1944. He was prompted and accused of murder of 3.5 million, but then he replied with only 2.5 million, claiming that the rest were killed by disease, starvation, and the conditions of his camp. He later revised his death toll whilst he was in Polish custody, but was ultimately sentenced to death for his horrific crimes. Polish survivors of Auschwitz lobbied for Hearst's execution to take place within Auschwitz on a specially constructed gallows that stood at the location of the camp's Gestapo quarters. Shortly before his death, Rudolf Höss acknowledged his crimes, stating, "My conscience compels me to make the following declaration. In the solitude of my prison cell, I have come to the bitter recognition that I have sinned gravely against humanity. As Commandant of Auschwitz, I was responsible for carrying out part of the cruel plans of the Third Reich for human destruction. In so doing, I have inflicted terrible wounds on humanity. I caused unspeakable suffering for the Polish people in particular. I am to pay for this with my life. May the Lord God forgive me one day what I have done. I ask the Polish people for forgiveness. In Polish prisons I have experienced for the first time what human kindness is. Despite all that has happened, I have experienced humane treatment which I could never have expected and which has deeply shamed me. May the facts which are now coming about the horrible crimes against humanity make the repetition of such cruel acts impossible for all time." The admission of guilt Hearst made about his time as a commandant of Auschwitz did nothing to appease or make up for the horror that he was responsible of whilst overseeing the death camp. Hearst was a despicable man who was motivated by causing as much death and destruction as possible, and his actions were driven by the Nazi race laws and ideology that he subscribed to. He was someone who wished to please Hitler, and more so Himmler, by efficiently causing mass devastation and death. He should also be held account for the actions of those guards who served under him, who carried out horrific acts of brutality and violence, but also he should be responsible for the starvation, disease, and horrific conditions inside the camp. The crimes of Rudolf Höss are endless, and today many of them remain untold. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.